Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2. We're looking at pre-modern medicine, pre-modern diet and health this week, starting with classical Greece and Rome. On Monday, Wednesday is medieval medicine and medieval diet, and then Friday is Renaissance. Slightly unusual week in terms of assignments. You have a regular reading response due Monday night. That's pretty normal. It should reference both the reading assignment, which is not terribly long, but also this video sort of background as well, because that's equally important. Wednesday is definitely different. There's a slideshow, basically, that I'll sort of talk through as a way of explaining medieval medicine, medieval diet, and how we should think about it, kind of getting rid of a lot of stereotypes that persist about medieval medicine. Gives us a little different perspective on our own medical system as well. No reading response due Wednesday. There's no reading assignment either. It's just the lecture and the lecture quiz. Friday, you have a regular reading assignment, and then the weekly reflection due Friday. So let's get into classical medicine. I think it's important to look back even at kind of the origins of what we consider to be the Western medical tradition in terms of ancient Greece and Rome. They were not only the direct basis for medicine until the 1700s, and in some places even in the 1800s. The general approach to medicine that they emphasized and how medicine should be done, and the sort of the method of medical practice and the intersection between theory and practice, how things get written down, how we reconcile different traditions and different sets of understandings and knowledge, that continues to be part of our medical tradition. In terms of diet or dietary advice, of course, exact knowledge has shifted. We research it and learn about it in different ways. You read a little bit about that last week. But many of the major precepts remain sound medical advice. So if you've ever heard of have a balanced diet or eat things in moderation, for instance, maybe the only two things people have always agreed on, that comes from ancient Greece and Rome. It probably was a lot earlier as well, but that's where we start to see it written down and emphasized repeatedly. So there is some things that persist, but most importantly, it's kind of just the way of practicing medicine, the way of, again, finding that balance between theory and practice. It's so-called rational medicine. Here is Asclepius. You can see he has the staff with a snake wrapped around it. It's called the caduceus. This is a modern emblem that we still use. It's on the logo of the American Medical Association. When we talk about ancient medicine, we should remember that there's a long tradition of medicine even before ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Here's a page from the Edwin Smith papyrus written about 1500 BCE. It talks about different surgical procedures, lots of different plants used for medicine. It's meant to be sort of a catalog of medical knowledge at the time. It's primarily surgery, which gives you an indication of their effort to preserve their experience, their knowledge, treating battlefield wounds, treating, it's not just surgery for fun. There's no such thing as elective surgery in the ancient world. It was an absolute last resort for obvious reasons. But the effort to preserve their medical knowledge stretches way back before Greece and Rome, even though that's where we start. I mentioned sort of the continuation of medical knowledge from Hippocrates, ancient Greece and Rome, to the modern day. One of the reasons is so-called rational medicine. It's the way of thinking about medicine in terms of, this is what Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, is famous for, thinking about medicine in rational terms. When you get sick, we think there's a cause. We can understand that cause. This was really kind of first written down and codified in what we call the Hippocratic tradition, following the thinking and students of Hippocrates. Here's, if you Google image search for Hippocrates, you get this. So all we know is we don't know anything about what Hippocrates looked like. He usually has a beard. That's as far as we can tell, and that might not even be true. We have no idea. We don't even know what he wrote, actually. We have a Hippocratic tradition, and Galen refers to Hippocrates a lot in the reading, as you'll see if you haven't done it already. But we don't actually know what he wrote or what his students wrote or what different physicians later who following his thinking wrote. Anyway, the one thing we know that the Hippocratic tradition is responsible for is illustrated here. Here's a text, a Hippocratic text called The Sacred Disease. It's about epilepsy. And the first line here really sums up Hippocratic medicine and rational medicine, and the reason we're going back to it in this second week of a class on diet and health. I do not believe that the sacred disease is any more divine or sacred than any other disease, but has specific characteristics and a definite cause. So even though epilepsy, even in the modern world, seems like a kind of mysterious disease, it's not divine punishment. It's not sacred. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with divinity. It has nothing to do with magic. It has a definite cause and specific characteristics, which means you can study it over time. You can learn what those characteristics are. You can understand what the cause is, and you can treat it. You can prevent it. You can do other things, right? If all disease is just some sort of caused by some sort of divine action, there's not much you can do about it. You're just kind of subject to it. But Hippocratic medicine, Greek medicine, classical medicine, as I like to call it, really is grounded in the belief that we can understand the cause. And really, it sounds so obvious to us now, like, well, of course, but this is the first time, really, in sort of any kind of medical tradition where we see this emphasis on finding a rational, direct cause of disease. When we look at text, we're reading one for Monday, Galen's text. It's very clear. It's a modern edition. It's printed. It's beautiful. It's easy to read, and so on. This is another example of a modern text. When we're understanding classical medicine, it's much harder to understand what a text actually is. Here's a typical example of a Hippocratic text. We have fragments. This is from, as you can see on the bottom here, the late first century BCE. Hippocrates lived around 400 BCE. Galen died 200 CE or AD, the height of the Roman Empire. So this is 2 or 3 centuries after Hippocrates, and you can see the condition of the text. So a lot of what we know about ancient medicine is stitching together fragments of texts here and there, references that people give us. A lot of these texts, especially Hippocratic and Galenic texts, meaning texts written supposedly by Hippocrates or Galen, were preserved in the Middle Ages in various manuscripts, especially in monasteries. They look like this, obviously much easier to read, but it's this textual tradition that gives us the continuity between the ancient world and the modern one. We'll look at stuff like this a lot more on Wednesday. Another thing that it helps us point out is standardization of medical knowledge. We take for granted that there's an objective body of knowledge we call medical knowledge, medical research and so on, that is the basis for treatment and understanding things. And certainly that exists. It's true. It's very helpful. In Galen's time, there isn't that same kind of standardization of knowledge. What constituted medical knowledge varied from place to place in different circumstances. It varied from physician to physician. There was a lot of disagreement about how the body worked, about what was good, about what was not good for it, and so on. So we have a very different perception of medical knowledge in the sense that it doesn't matter where you live. Big city, small town, Asia, Europe, America, South America, Antarctica, doesn't matter. Mars, medicine is the same. Medical knowledge is universal, right? We assume that that's kind of true. But we also, as many of you wrote about in your responses last week, in terms of dietary advice, we know it's far from universal, right? Different people respond differently to the same diet. So how much is medical knowledge generally more particular to individuals than we tend to recognize? What is the range? So these are these two things, standardization of knowledge, the social sort of standing of doctors, the cultural significance of medicine. These are things that we have created over time. They weren't always this way. They're not inevitable. They're choices that we have made to make medicine what it is. And we get a sense of the fact that these things exist, these features of medicine, by looking back at the ancient world or medieval or early modern world as we do this week and seeing how they didn't exist at all in the same way. Okay, let's get into Galen more specifically here. In the introduction to Galen, we read a few pages by Mark Grant. He's the person who did the translation of Galen's text. He mentioned that Galen was widely traveled. Doesn't explain why that's useful, though. So I wanted to comment about that. Why travel if you're an ancient physician? Why is it seen as useful to travel? A couple of reasons. One, you learn local customs, folk traditions. A lot of people in different places have their own sort of knowledge they've accumulated and passed on to each other over time. So sometimes that spreads, sometimes it doesn't, and it stays localized. So if you go and visit lots of places, you learn how those places have dealt with disease. What kind of diseases are they used to seeing? What are the symptoms like for them? It's comparative. You get to think about, why does this group of people see this kind of disease and this group of people see this kind of disease? How do they see the same disease but treat it differently? It makes you think about those differences. That helps you understand what disease is. The introduction mentions that Galen treated a lot of patients. 80% were in the social elite, meaning either wealthy or high political standing. He was also physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So all this is to say, he was a highly successful and highly anomalous human being. Okay, not many individuals can say that they shaped 1,500 years of human existence, but Galen can. He was the cornerstone of Western medicine. He became the voice of Hippocrates, again, whose writings had been sort of uncertain, but he took a lot of what he learned from Hippocratic writings and other physicians, we'll talk about that more in a second, and made it into a cohesive system of medicine, a cohesive way of thinking about health in the body. What were average physicians like? They were seen as craftsmen, like bricklayers. They had more knowledge about medical treatment than the average person, but they have a very particular view based on their experience. They might be illiterate, learning from experience, shadowing a family relative who was also a physician, somebody who could supposedly improve your health for a fee. That's what a physician was. If you wanted to be a doctor, you said, I'm a doctor, I can help you. Hopefully for the patient, you actually knew something, but it was very, very much a trade or a craft in the same way that sort of anything else was. No credentialing. So being a physician was like being a house builder. You learn from people who know more than you. You keep practicing. You learn different techniques. You see how different people in different places build houses. You see what things work, what things don't over time. It's just a skill, right? And how do you get patients? Well, you have success with patients. You develop a reputation. You promote yourself as having a lot of experience, treated a lot of patients. We see this in Galen's writings, even just in the small segment. He's constantly talking about how much he knows. Galen excelled at all these things. So it's very much a craft. Medicine in the ancient world was very much a craft, not the culturally and socially superior profession it is now. Partly, we have Galen to thank for the social transformation of medicine, which happened much later in the modern world and into what it is today. But he laid that foundation of very highly erudite person, usually men up until relatively recently, as a skilled physician. He helped create the idea of the physician that we now embrace. He starts by telling us that I've done some highlighting here in different colors that means different things. We'll get to that in a second. Everything is made up of air, water, fire, earth. Everything in the world is made up of these things. They're related to spring, summer, winter, autumn. They're related to, I didn't highlight it here, just below it, moisture, heat, dryness, and cold, the four qualities, the four seasons, the four elements, and the four humors. The basis for Western medicine for a long time is called humoralism. We'll see this over and over again, not only this week, but well beyond. Four humors: yellow bile, blood, phlegm, black bile. Okay. When we make proper use of foods and recipes, the attendant humors follow, right? So the different kinds of humors we have in our body changes as we get older, right? He's talking about puberty here, teenagers, and then he talks about sort of young adults. Then he talks about old age. There's phlegm. There reigns sluggishness, loss of memory, and lethargy, right? Old people are colder. They're sort of frailer. They don't have as much energy. They don't have as much blood. So their temperament is shifting as their body and their humors are shifting through the process of aging. Ratios and natural balance are key to maintaining health in Galen's formulation. You got to keep the humors in balance, but it's not like there's an equal amount of all of them. Every person has their own kind of temperament, which is their own ratio of the humors together. And there's lots of types of humors, right? As regard the color, blood is red, phlegm is white. There are 7 types of yellow bile. The proper tint of black bile is not black, as you might expect, but olive oil. So it's like a darker yellow. So there's a wide variety of humors. They vary in place to place, color, power, consistency, and quality. But the humors, right, this sort of magical combination of things inside the body determines our health. And the primary way we maintain our health or restore our health in the case of disease is by diet. That is what's so crucial about sort of ancient medicine and this whole week of looking at the history of medicine, is that diet was the main thing that you used. Diet was the first line of defense in medicine. Second was drugs. If diet didn't work, you needed stronger substances, and drugs made a stronger effect on the body. It's the same kind of thing we have now, really, except we don't emphasize diet nearly as much as Galen and classical physicians did. And then the last resort, of course, in the ancient world was surgery, as I mentioned about the Edwin Smith papyrus. Here's a definition of disease that's worth noting. Diseases occur when humors decrease or increase contrary to what their usual terms of quantity, quality, shifting of position, any kind of imbalance. Any deviation from your normal temperament means you have disease, literally dis-ease. You're not your normal self. Everything is based in this idea of the humors being in their correct proportions for an individual. And it's easy to think modern or classical medicine or ancient medicine or pre-modern medicine is a joke. I mean, how good can medical practice be when this is your basis for medicine, the 4 humors? We'll talk more about that on Wednesday, so I'll stop there. But it's not the case. People would continue to think this way if it wasn't useful. So it's very different from how we think, obviously. It doesn't mean it's totally ineffective. It does mean there's limitations, but it means there's also some other advantages as well that we'll get into later. So you have to understand the cause. This is the Hippocratic tradition that Galen is following. Galen is very clear in lots of places that you have to understand the cause of disease if you want to treat it. Again, going back to that sort of rational medical approach that we talked about earlier. And it's funny when you think about the modern pharmaceutical industry, because they have no interest in causes whatsoever. It's just treating symptoms, right? Which is good. You have to just keep buying their product. A couple of you mentioned this in your post for last week, and you were spot on, right? Causes of diseases in the ancient world wasn't germs. They didn't have that concept until much, much later, the 1870s, 80s, 90s. So relatively recently. But they did write about ancient physicians. Hippocrates, Galen wrote about epidemics. They wrote about pandemics, diseases that come from far away and affect very, very big regions. Plague was always a concern. Okay, I've highlighted some things in green here, and as I scroll through, you see that references to Hippocrates, and this is one of the reasons, one of the ways Galen establishes his expertise. He's constantly reminding his reader and his patients, how well learned he is in the Hippocratic tradition, right? Not only does he have a lot of his own experience, but he's read everything, and he knows what everyone has said, and he's able to pick and choose from what is most consistent and what jives with his own vast experience. But he's also very critical of people he doesn't think is following the right method. I don't understand how, by omitting so many pieces of evidence, that you could assign the complete categorization of diseases to colors alone. On the powers of foods, so you go through this text, a considerable number of outstanding physicians have written, but not as well as I'm going to. Right? This is one of the most important of all medical subjects, the powers of foods. But he's going to outline it. And he goes through, we're reading just a couple of pages. It may seem like a lot, 15 pages or something. He goes on for hundreds of pages about every food, about every dish, about every sort of combination. And he's trying to be incredibly thorough about sort of how foods can interact and how we can know, at least in theory, what's going on with the food inside our body. Criticizing a predecessor, Diocles, he said he could understand the powers of foods through just one experiment and not from the temperament or the humors, right? So again, arguing with past physicians saying, you can't do just one experiment. You have to do a lot. You have to have wide experience over lots of patients over a lot of period of time. This is going to make you the best physician. I, Galen, am the best physician because I've done all these things. Method, very important to Galen. So in this book, I will state my definitions carefully, just as I did in my other books. I've written so many books. This is my usual method. I'm not going to abandon it. I've always asked these people personal experience, what the nature and symptoms are. You can test the truth of the whole argument, right? He's sort of empowering his reader, his patients, to understand how smart he is, right? You can test the truth of this. You can evaluate for yourself, right? He's all about evidence. Eating is all about balance, right? It's all about balancing the hot, cold, wet, and dry. Here, it's in this highlighted bit right here. If the human body should be average in temperament, it should be kept in its present state by eating foods in average temperament. Don't eat super spicy foods. Don't eat super cold foods, or at least balance them out with something else. If you get diseased, if you have dis-ease, you need to sort of figure out, is it making you too hot or too cold? Is it increasing your phlegm or blood? What do you need to do? You need to eat something that's going to sort of counteract that. So food is the best medicine, right? Rather than drugs, rather than surgery, you need to change your diet. But everyone's diet is different. Everyone behaves differently. Again, many of you commented on this, so it seems obvious, but Galen here is arguing against the universality of dietary advice, which is kind of funny because it's a cornerstone of how we now think about nutrition, right? Most people should eat the same thing, right? We have dietary guidelines, dietary advice that are supposed to apply to everybody. But Galen here in 200 CE is talking about how you can't argue whether something like honey is healthy, because it is for some people and it's harmful for others. Not everyone has the same temperament, right? And depending on what foods you eat it with, or what time of year, or what else you're doing, how much exercise you're getting, that makes honey healthy or not. So there's no way you can have this generic advice. You have to think about the foods and the temperament of the individual on a very, very sort of one-to-one basis. So keep everything in balance. Completeness of digestion is very important. You can see that from moving through the text as well. You need to avoid blockages. You need to avoid humors coagulating. You need to avoid foods that sort of stop up your system. Getting everything fluid and flowing in the body is a key precept of pre-modern medicine. We'll see a lot of that on Friday and next week as well. When we get to medicine in the 1700s and 1800s, they're saying the same thing that Galen is talking about here. What Galen talks about is his own experience, right? His own vast experience. This is a technique that you still see in modern dietary texts, right? Any kind of fad diet has somebody who, the creator or a proponent, somebody who says, I tried this diet, nothing worked for me, I tried it, I lost a lot of weight, or whatever the goal was. I told my friends to do it, they did it, and everything is very anecdotal, right? Galen's using this technique in a way, I wouldn't say that he pioneered it, but it's certainly the biggest sort of written example we have of physicians talking about how their own personal experience, coupled with wide learning, textual learning, makes him the most qualified physician. It's a technique that's persisted literally throughout the entire history of Western medicine and dietary advice, this appeal to personal experience. Many of you commented on that as well. Experience, right? That's all the green highlighting is for. It is not possible to see a captain of a ship or practitioner of another skill emerge from a book, right? Medicine is both the experience of seeing patients, looking at symptoms, understanding how they relate to causes, and also looking at text. And of course, Galen is very clear here. If anyone lacks a teacher and wants to read carefully in the sort of detail that I employ, because I know more, I can give you more details than everyone. It's very important. But experience and evidence are absolutely crucial. Galen is very clear, as he's talking about previous physicians, that they haven't given enough proof or evidence, right? And this is very important to his own credentialing and his own sort of self-promotion, because he's trying to make an argument to his patients or potential patients that everything he does doesn't come from just some like general theory that he's learned. It comes from experience and direct evidence. So if you don't have actual experience that results in true knowledge, you're just making things up to sound smart or effective. You need to have evidence and detailed evidence. And if people who tell you something is true and can't give you any details or any evidence, you shouldn't believe them. Okay. Galen was also very good at cooking. the best breads are those that are baked under a dome. There's been a lot of people writing about sourdough and baking bread because of COVID. Everyone's stuck at home. And one of the advice you can read constantly is the value of baking your bread in a Dutch oven, because it creates a little insulated, moist, humid environment that gets you a better crust. If you don't use a Dutch oven, your crust is overcooked and your crumb is undercooked, right? This is modern baking advice right here. Galen's giving it to us at 200 CE. I just had to end with that. Okay, that's enough. I will talk to you again on Wednesday.